The haunted house on Ashford Hill. In a small, forgotten town nestled in the hills, there was a house that no one dared to approach. The Ashford House, as it was called, had stood abandoned for decades, its walls darkened by time and neglect. The locals spoke of its cursed history, and none had ever dared to enter after the night of the disappearance of the previous inhabitants. The story began many years ago, when a young couple, Thomas and Mary, moved into the grand, yet decaying house. They were drawn to its eerie charm, its tall, crooked spires, and its sprawling gardens that seemed to stretch endlessly into the mist. The house, despite its age, had a sort of mysterious beauty, and the couple, tired of city life, believed it would be the perfect place for a fresh start. On their first night in the house, a strange coldness filled the air. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows. As the couple settled in for the night, they noticed an odd thing. Every clock in the house stopped at exactly 3 a.m. They laughed it off as a coincidence, but soon, that laughter faded into uneasy silence as an unsettling presence filled the rooms. At first, it was subtle. Whispers in the corners of the room. Flickers of movement from the corner of their eyes. But soon, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors that had been closed tightly would open by themselves. Shadows that didn't belong to anyone moved in the hallways. The house seemed to be alive, breathing, watching them. One evening, Thomas, eager to understand what was happening, decided to investigate. He wandered down into the basement, where the air was thick with dust and an unbearable cold. The further he went, the darker the shadows became. In the corner of the basement, behind an old wooden chest, he found something that made his blood run cold, a mirror old and tarnished, covered in strange symbols. As he touched it, a chill ran up his spine, and the room seemed to warp around him. Suddenly, he was no longer alone. A figure appeared in the mirror, an image of a woman, her face twisted in agony, her eyes hollow and dark. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Thomas felt a hand grab his shoulder. Whipping around, he found no one there. But when he turned back to the mirror, the woman was gone. Terrified, Thomas ran back upstairs, but the house felt different now. The walls groaned, as though the house itself was alive and angry. That night, Thomas and Mary both had the same dream. A woman, dressed in black, standing in the middle of a stormy field, her face obscured by long matted hair. Her voice whispered to them, pleading for help. She begged them to leave before it was too late. But the nightmare didn't end there. The following night, Mary disappeared without a trace. One moment, she was sitting next to Thomas, and the next, she was gone. The house was silent, and the once lively home seemed to swallow her whole. In panic, Thomas searched the house from top to bottom, calling her name, but there was no answer. He was alone. The next few days were a blur of dread. Thomas could feel the presence of something watching him. The whispers grew louder, and the house seemed to close in on him, its walls pressing tighter around him. He realized that the woman in the mirror was not just a ghost, she was a warning. The house had claimed Mary, and it would not stop until it took him too. Driven by desperation, Thomas returned to the basement, determined to destroy the cursed mirror. But as he reached the dark, forgotten corner, he found something he hadn't noticed before, an old journal, its pages yellowed with age. The journal told the tragic history of the house. It had once belonged to a wealthy family, the Ashfords, who had practiced dark rituals in the house, hoping to gain immortality. But their experiments had gone horribly wrong. In a bid to cheat death, they had summoned a malevolent spirit, a being that now haunted the house, taking the souls of anyone who dared to live there. The journal revealed that the woman in the mirror was the spirit of the last Ashford, a woman named Eliza, who had been the final sacrifice in a failed ritual. Her spirit had been bound to the house, and she was doomed to watch as every new inhabitant met their fate. The curse of Ashford House was not just a haunting, it was a trap, set to ensnare the souls of those who dared to enter. Thomas knew he had to leave, but it was already too late. The house had him. The lights flickered and the walls groaned, and when Thomas tried to run, the house twisted and turned, the hallways never leading him to the door. The dark presence in the house was too strong, and Thomas was pulled into the shadows. The townspeople, those who had heard the rumors, spoke of the Ashford house for years after. They said the house was still there waiting. The whispers in the wind carried the story of Thomas and Mary, the couple who disappeared without a trace. They said the house had a way of luring people in, drawing them with its beauty and mystery, only to trap them forever. And so Ashford House stood, silent and waiting, its curse unbroken, its dark secrets buried beneath the crumbling stone. No one dared to venture near it again, for everyone knew the truth. Once you entered Ashford House, you were never truly alone, and you would never, ever leave. And to this day, when the wind blows through the hills, some swear they hear the faint whispers of a woman calling for help, echoing from the haunted depths of the Ashford House. The Curse of Black Hollow Manor. In a remote part of the country, hidden deep within an eerie forest, there stood a mansion known as Black Hollow Manor. It had been abandoned for over a century, its towering Gothic structure slowly crumbling under the weight of time. The locals often spoke of the manor with a mix of fear and awe, and no one dared approach it, for it was said to be cursed. The tale of Black Hollow Manor began many years ago, when it was first built by Lord Charles Hawthorne, a wealthy and ambitious man known for his eccentricities. He had a beautiful wife, Isabella, and together they had a daughter, Evelyn. But despite their seemingly perfect family, a dark secret lurked within the walls of their grand home. Lord Hawthorne was a man obsessed with immortality. He was deeply influenced by ancient texts and occult practices, believing that through rituals and sacrifices, he could gain eternal life. His obsession with death and the afterlife grew over time, and soon, the once-loving family began to fall apart. The house became his sanctuary, filled with strange symbols and arcane artifacts. It was said that the walls themselves seemed to whisper at night, secrets of ancient powers that promised to give him what he desired most. One night, Lord Hawthorne performed a forbidden ritual, calling upon a powerful spirit to grant him immortality. But things went terribly wrong. The ritual backfired, and instead of receiving the gift of eternal life, Lord Hawthorne unleashed something far worse. An ancient, vengeful spirit, bound to the earth for centuries, was freed. The spirit, known as Morvith, was a malevolent entity that thrived on torment and suffering. It was said to be a creature born of darkness, a force that could manipulate reality itself and feed on the fear of its victims. The following days were filled with strange occurrences. The mansion grew colder, and the shadows in the halls seemed to take on a life of their own. Isabella and Evelyn were the first to disappear. One evening, they were simply gone, vanished without a trace, leaving only the faint scent of perfume in the air and a cold chill that never seemed to leave the house. Lord Hawthorne, desperate to find his wife and daughter, searched every room of the mansion, but they were nowhere to be found. He could hear their voices at night, whispering his name from the dark corners of the manor, but no matter how hard he tried, he could never reach them. Morvith's influence grew stronger, and it was clear that the spirit had claimed the souls of his family. As the years passed, the mansion fell into ruin. No one dared approach Black Hollow Manor, for the rumors of strange lights, blood-curdling screams, and the feeling of being watched kept everyone at bay. The locals said that on stormy nights, the mansion could be seen from miles away, its windows glowing with a faint, eerie light. The wind carried the sound of mournful cries, and some claimed to see a figure standing at the windows, a woman, her face obscured by long, tangled hair, her eyes empty and hollow. Then, one fateful day, a curious young man named Samuel, driven by the allure of mystery and the promise of uncovering the truth, ventured into the haunted forest. He had heard the tales of Black Hollow Manor since he was a child, and now, as an adult, his curiosity had reached its peak. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and his determination, he set out to explore the mansion, eager to discover its secrets. When Samuel arrived at the manor, he was struck by the sheer size of it. The mansion seemed to loom over him, its dark silhouette blending with the night sky. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the moment he stepped inside, a wave of coldness washed over him. The walls creaked and groaned, as though the house itself was alive and watching him. He wandered through the grand hallways, the floors covered in dust and cobwebs, the air heavy with the scent of decay. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, and doors that led nowhere stood open, inviting him to explore further. As he ventured deeper into the house, Samuel began to feel a growing unease. The atmosphere felt oppressive, as though something was lurking just beyond his vision. As he reached the top of the stairs, he heard it, the sound of soft footsteps behind him. He whipped around, but no one was there. His heart raced, and he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The temperature dropped, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, twisting and writhing like living creatures. Samuel continued to explore, despite the growing sense of danger. He found his way into a large, ornate room at the back of the house. There, in the center of the room, stood a grand mirror. The mirror was old and tarnished, but as Samuel gazed into it, he saw something that made his blood run cold, a reflection of a woman, standing behind him, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. Before he could turn around, the door slammed shut behind him, and the room was plunged into darkness. Samuel's flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in complete blackness. He could feel the presence of something sinister closing in on him. His breath quickened as he heard the soft whispers again, voices calling his name, pleading for help. Suddenly, a cold hand touched his shoulder. He spun around in terror, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of heavy breathing, as though something or someone was standing right next to him. Panic set in as he realized he was trapped, and the walls seemed to close in around him. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and the temperature dropped to freezing. Just as he was about to scream, a voice echoed through the room, a deep guttural voice that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "You shouldn't have come here," it growled. "Now you belong to me." The lights flickered back on, and Samuel saw a figure standing before him, Morvith, the ancient spirit. Its face was a twisted mask of agony and rage, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The spirit reached out to grab him, its icy fingers wrapping around his throat. Samuel fought with all his strength, but it was no use. The spirit's grip tightened, and as his vision blurred, he realized the terrible truth. He was now just another soul trapped in Black Hollow Manor, destined to roam its cursed halls for eternity. From that day on, no one saw Samuel again. The mansion remained as it always had, silent, dark, and waiting. The curse of Black Hollow Manor had claimed another victim, and its power continued to grow stronger with each passing year. The villagers still speak of the manor, and sometimes on stormy nights, they say you can hear the echoes of Samuel's screams, carried on the wind. And if you listen closely, you might hear the soft, mournful whispers of Isabella and Evelyn, still trapped in the house, forever lost to the darkness. The curse of Black Hollow Manor endures, and as long as the mansion stands, the souls of those who dared enter will never be free. They are all prisoners of the darkness, waiting for the next curious soul to step inside, so the cycle can begin again. The Wraith of Hollow Creek. In the desolate countryside of England, tucked away between dense forests and rolling hills, stood a crumbling mansion known as Hollow Creek Manor. The locals had long abandoned the area, whispering only hushed stories of its cursed past. For as long as anyone could remember, the mansion had been empty, its windows dark and silent, save for the occasional gust of wind that would make the windows rattle, like the faint sound of a long-lost voice calling from within. But some said that the house wasn't truly empty, that there was something that dwelled in the dark corners of Hollow Creek Manor. The tale of Hollow Creek Manor began more than a century ago with a man named Sir Thomas Whitfield. Sir Thomas was a man known for his wealth, his charm, and his obsession with the occult. He was not content with earthly pleasures. He sought the supernatural, hoping to gain knowledge and power beyond the realm of the living. His fascination with spirits and dark rituals led him to travel far and wide, seeking ancient texts and forbidden knowledge. One cold evening, after years of studying the dark arts, Sir Thomas stumbled upon a forbidden grimoire, a book so ancient that its pages were said to have been bound with human skin. It was in this book that he found the ritual he had been searching for, the summoning of the Wraith. The ritual, when performed correctly, could open a portal to the other side, allowing a spirit to cross over into the living world. But what Sir Thomas did not know was that the spirit he would summon was not a benevolent one. It was a malevolent wraith, a creature born from the darkness, whose only purpose was to spread fear and death. That night, Sir Thomas set the ritual in motion. He stood in the center of his grand manor, candles flickering around him, the air thick with the scent of incense and something darker. The room grew colder with each word he spoke from the grimoire, the shadows lengthening and twisting in unnatural shapes. As the final incantation was uttered, a chill ran through the room, and a deep, unnatural silence fell. The air felt thick, as if the very world had paused, holding its breath. And then a figure appeared. The wraith was like nothing Sir Thomas had ever imagined. It was neither human nor spirit, but something far worse, a shadowy, transparent figure, its face obscured by darkness, its body rippling like smoke in the air. Its eyes burned with a cold, malevolent light, and as it stepped closer, the temperature in the room dropped to freezing. The wraith reached out its hands, and Sir Thomas, in his hubris, allowed it to touch him. In an instant, Sir Thomas's body went rigid with pain. The wraith's touch was like ice, freezing his very soul. He tried to scream, but no sound came from his mouth. His body crumbled under the wraith's grasp, and his heart stopped beating. But he was not dead, not truly. The wraith had taken his soul, trapping it in the dark abyss between life and death. As the years passed, Hollow Creek Manor fell into disrepair. Its once pristine halls were overrun with dust and cobwebs, and the grand gardens withered, overtaken by weeds and thorns. But the wraith remained. It waited in the shadows, feeding on the fear of anyone who dared to step foot inside. No one dared approach the manor, for the townsfolk knew that the curse of Sir Thomas and the wraith would claim any who did. Then, one fateful day, a group of curious travelers, seeking adventure and thrills, arrived in the village. They had heard the legends of Hollow Creek Manor and its dark history, and they were determined to uncover the truth. Among them was a young man named Ethan, a skeptic who did not believe in ghosts or curses. He laughed at the stories, dismissing them as mere superstition. The group made their way through the overgrown path that led to the manor, the air thick with fog. As they approached the mansion, the temperature seemed to drop, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it an eerie sense of unease. But Ethan was undeterred. He led the group to the front door, which creaked open with a faint groan as if the house itself was welcoming them in. Inside, the house was still and silent. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. The air smelled stale, like the remnants of something long forgotten. But it wasn't the dust or decay that sent shivers down their spines. It was the feeling that something was watching them, something unseen but undeniably present. As the group explored the manor, they began to hear strange noises, soft whispers in the distance, footsteps echoing through the halls, and doors that creaked open on their own. Ethan, determined to prove that the legends were false, wandered deeper into the mansion, leaving his friends behind. He found himself in a large, dimly lit room at the back of the house, the walls adorned with old portraits of the Whitfield family. But there was something off about the portraits. The eyes of the people in the paintings seemed to follow him, their gazes dark and accusing. Ethan's flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. As he turned around, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. At first, he thought it was one of his friends playing a prank. But then he saw it more clearly. The figure was tall and thin, draped in tattered black robes. Its face was hidden in darkness, but Ethan could feel its eyes on him, burning with hatred. Without thinking, he ran. He rushed down the hall, his heart pounding in his chest, but the mansion seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in on him. He could hear the wraith behind him, its footsteps growing louder and louder, but when he turned, there was nothing there. Only the oppressive darkness, creeping ever closer. In his panic, Ethan stumbled into the room where the wraith had first appeared to Sir Thomas. The room was cold, the air thick with a presence that seemed to choke him. As he backed away, he bumped into something, a mirror, long abandoned and covered in dust. The glass was cracked, But as he gazed into it, he saw something that made his heart stop. The reflection was not his own. Instead, it was a twisted, pale version of himself, grinning with malice. The reflection reached out of the mirror, its bony hand wrapping around Ethan's throat. The wraith's laughter echoed in Ethan's ears as he felt his life force drain away. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was the wraith's burning eyes, filled with eternal rage. The wraith had claimed another victim. When the rest of the group found Ethan's lifeless body, they immediately fled, leaving Hollow Creek Manor behind. But the curse of the wraith would not be so easily broken. The mansion still stands, its windows dark and empty, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to enter. And if you listen closely on a still night, you might hear the whispers of the wraith, calling out to the living, beckoning them to join the countless others trapped in its eternal grasp. The haunting of Ravenwood Asylum. Ravenwood Asylum had long been abandoned. Its towering, crumbling walls still stood like sentinels in the dense forest, silent witnesses to the horrors that had once taken place inside. The asylum, built in the late 1800s, had been a place where society's forgotten souls were locked away, those with mental illnesses, those who were different, those who had nowhere else to go. But what most didn't know was that Ravenwood was also a place of unspeakable experiments, dark rituals, and the birth of something far worse than any of the patients inside. The asylum had been founded by Dr. Victor Langley, a renowned but deeply eccentric psychiatrist. He was known for his controversial methods of treatment, which involved cruel therapies and dangerous experimentation. His obsession with the human mind led him to push the boundaries of morality and ethics, conducting horrific tests on his patients, all in the name of science. He believed that he could control the human psyche, that he could tap into the very essence of the soul and, in doing so, free humanity from the burdens of mental illness. As the years passed, Dr. Langley's methods grew more and more extreme. He began performing invasive surgeries, using electric shocks, and even attempting to communicate with the dead. He sought to find a way to manipulate life and death, to control the boundary between the living and the afterlife. But his actions had consequences, unseen, dangerous consequences that no one could have foreseen. One night, during a particularly gruesome experiment, something went horribly wrong. Dr. Langley had been attempting to summon the spirit of a long-dead patient, a woman named Sarah Bennett who had died under his care. She had been one of his earliest experiments, and her death had haunted him for years. He believed that by calling her spirit back, he could learn the secrets of the afterlife and gain unparalleled power over the living. But when he performed the ritual, something far darker than Sarah's spirit emerged. A force, ancient and malevolent, took hold of the asylum. The spirit that was summoned was not Sarah but a being far more powerful, a vengeful entity that thrived on suffering and torment. The moment the ritual was completed, the asylum was plunged into darkness. The lights flickered, and the air grew thick with an oppressive energy. The patients, who had been locked away in their cells, began to scream in terror as the walls seemed to close in on them. Some said they could hear the voice of the entity whispering in their ears, promising them torment for eternity. Dr. Langley, realizing his mistake too late, tried to undo the ritual, but it was futile. The entity had already claimed its first victim, him. His body was found days later, twisted and unrecognizable, his face frozen in an expression of horror. But Dr. Langley's death was just the beginning. The entity's power grew, and Ravenwood Asylum became its domain, a place of unimaginable suffering. The asylum's doors were locked, and no one dared enter. Over the years, rumors spread about the place, tales of the restless spirits that haunted the halls, of the wraiths that would stalk anyone who dared venture too close. The local townsfolk spoke of strange lights flickering in the windows at night, of ghostly figures seen standing in the broken windows, staring out at the world. They said the asylum was cursed, that the souls of the patients and Dr. Langley himself were trapped inside, doomed to suffer for all eternity. And yet, despite the warnings, a group of adventurous thrill-seekers decided to explore Ravenwood. Among them was a young woman named Clara, who had heard the stories all her life and was determined to uncover the truth. Clara had always been drawn to the macabre, to the unknown, and Ravenwood Asylum seemed like the perfect challenge. One evening, as the sun set behind the towering trees, Clara and her group made their way into the heart of the forest, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the ground. They had heard that the asylum's gates were still intact, though rusted and overgrown with ivy. As they approached, the air seemed to grow colder, and an uneasy silence fell over the group. The doors creaked open with a haunting groan, and they stepped inside. The interior of Ravenwood Asylum was a nightmare. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floors were littered with broken glass and debris.